Mohammed Shehada, you're a Palestinian analyst from Gaza originally. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, can I just get your initial reaction to the numbers that we're seeing? Just now, we received sort of news notifications that almost 1,000 Palestinians have been killed in the past 48 hours, I believe, or whenever it was that Israel re broke the ceasefire agreement and started bombing Gaza again. What are your reactions to this?
It's basically a carnage of unprecedented nature for the last year or over a year. And it's very deliberate. The purpose of it is a carnage. It's nothing more. So there's not a single Hamas militant that was declared dead since Israel bombed Gaza um, 2 days ago and killed over 460 people. There's only four. The most prominent names are four government officials. So it's the acting prime minister, the acting minister of justice, the acting minister of interior, and the head of the internal security agency. Basically, about half of the people that were killed are children. Uh, I've seen a lot of brutality over the last 16 months of genocide in Gaza, but Israel always finds a way to shock you even more, to open your wounds anew. And the nature of the casualties from the last 2 days is frightening. You see babies, dozens in lying cold on hospital floors, nameless, unknown. And the most shocking part of it is not a single tear, not a single condemnation, not even a mention. There's not even curiosity to know the names of those victims because their last name is not Bibas and the perpetrator is Israel. So it suddenly becomes okay to do this. There's also the other dimension of basically entire families being extinguished again. So I have a friend whose sister, her husband, their kids, their in-laws, and their grandchildren were all killed in the same airstrike. Um, it's frightening. It's even more frightening the underwhelming reaction to it. That you see mainstream media just simply putting a headline where it says 400 Palestinians in Gaza are killed despite ceasefire. It shies away from calling out that Israel is basically destroying the ceasefire. Like the entire time the genocide was unfolding in Gaza, you kept hearing the same Israeli talking point. There was a ceasefire on October 6th. There was a ceasefire on October 6th. There was a ceasefire on March 17th
Yeah.
when Israel decided to unleash that carnage. There was not a ceasefire on October 6th because on October 6th itself, Israel was still killing people in Gaza. So as my late friend Rifat al-Arair put it, the poet that Israel killed in 2023, he said a ceasefire is when Palestinians seize and Israel continues to fire. And you have Israeli government officials that are echoing the exact same sentiment shamelessly. So, for example, you have Ehud Barak, who was defense minister and prime minister. Operation Cast Lead was 2008-9 when he was defense minister. And he said, look, once you sign a ceasefire, nobody's going to bother with the details. Once it goes into effect, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And that's the same dynamic here. As soon as the ceasefire was signed, Israel, before this massive bombardment, they killed over 150 civilians, women and children and men throughout Gaza in the last 50 days. You would barely even find any mention of those numbers. There's not even like an interest in mainstream media to calculate how many were killed since the ceasefire started. You would find like sporadic reports of one person here, nine there, 10 here, nothing more. Can you imagine if a single Israeli was scratched in the ceasefire? All hell would have broken loose. Like Palestinians are the most self-restrained people on the face of the earth. That Israel would kill now over 600 people during a ceasefire, and there's not a single bullet being fired from Gaza. It shows who's desperate, who's keen to end the war, and who's desperate to continue a forever carnage. There's the other dimension is that it was completely unsurprising. So you had a Haaretz journalist, Ori Misgav, who wrote prophetically a couple of hours before Israel bombed Gaza with these 80 simultaneous airstrikes. He wrote, quote, "The walls are closing in on Netanyahu." And then he went on to explain that Netanyahu has all these crises. His wife is about to be interrogated for intimidating witnesses. He had his corruption trial testimony that he was trying to run away from and cancel and was scheduled yesterday. He also had a national crisis brewing after he attempted to fire the attorney general and the head of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security agency. He had also another crisis with the budget. Ultra-Orthodox parties are threatening not to allow the budget to pass through the Knesset, which means the government would be dismantled and there would be early elections. And he had basically Israeli mass demonstrations scheduled in Jerusalem in front of his residence yesterday. So the answer to all of these has traditionally been whenever Israel's right-wing government is in crisis, nothing would get them out, nothing would unite or maintain the government cohesion more than Palestinian blood and destruction to be displayed on national TV, the suffering, the pain, the trauma, the carnage. And that's what you had there. As soon as those airstrikes unfolded, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the right-wing former head of the minister of the police, he immediately announces he's returning to the government, conveniently in time enough to pass the budget. There's another dimension of basically Israel's uh, government being determined to destroy the Arab Egyptian plan for Gaza's early recovery and reconstruction. Basically, there were reports a couple of days ago that Trump gave some sort of initial approval. He had a lot of questions, a lot of edits and comments, reservations, but he gave an initial approval. Gaza to be rebuilt without a mass population transfer, without depopulating it and replacing the population with Israeli settlers. And there was an Egyptian major reconstruction conference scheduled in April for Gaza. So the way to take all of these off the table, all of your headaches are gone as soon as you bomb Gaza again and engage in a forever war.
Yeah. Um, do you want to walk us through a little bit the proper way to view the resumption of hostilities now? Because there are media companies around the world are talking about Israel bombing Gaza again in different ways and spinning it in different ways. And I think you and I would maybe view this as Israel breaking the ceasefire agreement and resuming the war on Gaza. But other people are saying that Hamas broke the ceasefire agreement by not agreeing to extend phase one, and Hamas didn't release hostages in the proper way, so it's somehow their fault. And I know you hold Hamas to account, and I definitely want to come back to that. But just I know that you've also written about the technicalities of the ceasefire agreement and what exactly happened. So could you just walk us through first of all, Israel's violations of the ceasefire agreement before they started bombing Gaza in this intense way 2 days ago, where more than 100 people, maybe I think 150 people were killed since the ceasefire agreement took effect, and then what Israel wanted with the extension of phase one, and in what way they then broke against that.
So basically, as soon as the ceasefire agreement went into effect, Israel began violating it promptly. For example, they were supposed to allow caravans, bulldozers, and trucks to go into Gaza immediately. If you remember Biden's speech from May last year, he said as soon as the ceasefire is signed, there would be hundreds of thousands of temporary homes and shelters going into Gaza immediately. Immediately. None of that entered. Zero. They were supposed to allow 200,000 tents into Gaza. People are freezing in the winter. A lot of people dying basically from pneumonia and different diseases from the cold, frostbites. And Israel only allowed 20,000, 10% of the amount that was supposed to go in. They allowed 30% of the fuel that was supposed to go in, which is the amount that was scheduled to go into Gaza was the minimal needed for hospitals to continue to function, as well as water infrastructure for people in Gaza to get basically drinkable water or even salty water pumped from the sea. They were allowed about 70% of the amount of humanitarian aid and food that was supposed to go in. So it was supposed to be 450 trucks of food and aid and 50 trucks of fuel. Before October 7th, Israel was allowing sometimes 900 trucks per day. So it's nowhere near the minimum needed. But still, even then, they allowed about 70% of it. They were basically, as you said, killing people in the dozens in airstrikes. The journalists that were killed over the weekend, 9 journalists and humanitarian workers from Al Khair Foundation, that is registered and operating in the UK, in the United Kingdom, killed in an airstrike without any excuse or pretext. The only reason Israel gave was basically they were flying a drone to film the massive destruction in northern Gaza, as well as their humanitarian operations. that was ground enough to murder every one of those nine humanitarian workers and journalists. There
Wow.
was also another dimension of basically Israel preventing Gazans that are stuck in Egypt. There's 150,000 of them. There's Gazans stuck elsewhere in Europe, around the world, that were trying to go back into Gaza. They were preventing every single one of them from crossing in. They rendered the border crossing to be a one-way ticket. No entry back, only exit. And even with the one-way ticket, they were supposed to allow 250 people to go out daily. The number they allowed was about 50, so less than 20% of the amount that was supposed to go out, with immense restrictions, blackmail, and sort of obstructions and obstacles in the way. There was also the suspension or the immediate ban of all food, water, electricity, fuel as soon as phase one ended. Although the ceasefire agreement said phase one would be extended indefinitely as long as phase two negotiations are happening. But that's the loophole that Israel used. Phase two negotiations were scheduled to start on February 6th. So phase two is supposed to be when the IDF would fully withdraw from Gaza and there would be a permanent end of hostilities in Gaza, an end to the war, basically. And February 6th comes, no Israeli delegation is in sight. The Qataris, the Egyptians reach out to the Israelis and are like, we're supposed to sit down and negotiate phase two now. Where are you? Netanyahu doesn't send a single person, no mandate to negotiate. February 7th, 8th, 9th, the whole month of February passed by, nothing. You get to March 2nd, the end of phase one, nothing. On March 2nd itself, the very last day, Netanyahu comes out and says, okay, now we don't have enough time to negotiate phase two. So let's extend phase one by releasing more of the captives that are in Hamas's captivity right now, the majority of whom are now soldiers. So basically, Netanyahu comes out and says, start releasing those for phase one to be extended. But the ceasefire agreement said explicitly phase one will be extended indefinitely. And I verified it with the mediators. It will be extended indefinitely as long as phase two negotiations are still ongoing. Then you have different proposals being put on the table. The Israeli proposal is release half of the hostages that remain in Hamas's captivity on the first day, about 10 or 12 of them, and we will extend phase one by another 40 days, 50 days, which means that Israel will never commit to ending the war. It's just a pause to get hostages out and then back to fighting again. And there's not even a reciprocal element. So Israel released about I would say 1,000 Palestinian captives, detainees, prisoners, and hostages in February. They kidnapped about 800 in February. So they just detained and kidnapped as many as they released without a charge, without a trial, without legal counsel, without visits from the Red Cross. So effectively a hostage held as a bargaining chip. Because as soon as Israel holds those 800 people, they use them in the negotiations as quote strategic assets to tell Hamas, okay, release some more. We gave you those 800 that we just kidnapped without any pretext whatsoever. There were also Palestinian hostages, and I emphasize hostages because they're held in state Iman without charge, legal counsel, trial, anything. And I have a friend whose brother is held that way in state Iman, what Israel's own leading human rights organization, B'Tselem, calls a torture camp. And his brother was told by the IDF, you are here until the end of the war. When the war is over, we're going to let you go. So you're not here under any pretext whatsoever. You're here as a bargaining chip. So with those that are in state Iman, they were even killed in captivity. There were about, I think, 6 to 8 Palestinian hostages in state Iman that were killed during the ceasefire. What the Americans came into the picture, tried to propose, was two parallel channels of negotiation. There was the Steve Witkoff one, that's the official one that talks to Netanyahu and then to the mediators, and the mediators would pass the message to Hamas because Israel and Hamas don't meet face to face, and the same Israel, the Americans and Hamas. And there was another channel communication that was secret under the radar. That was Biden's hostage negotiations, Trump's hostage negotiations envoy, Adam Boehler, that was engaged in talks with Hamas over 4 separate meetings since January. And he managed to reach a very, very solid outline. If you think Hamas are horrible, are a terrorist group, are the problem, are to blame, Adam Boehler's outline was basically this. There would be a truce in Gaza for 5 to 10 years. in which Hamas would step down completely from government and lay down their arms, and tunnels that cross into Israel would be fully dismantled. That was the outline. And he was impressed. There was another element. As a sign of good faith, Hamas should release the American Israeli hostages, Aidan Alexander, alive, and four other bodies on the first day. And there would be 250 Palestinian prisoners and captives that are released at the same time. And phase two negotiations would start. Israel got a whiff of that channel communication. Their reaction to Hamas offering to lay down their arms, a truce for 5 to 10 years, dismantling tunnels, was Israel went into a state of panic. You saw it every day on Israeli media, Israeli government statements. They were attacking under the table. They were pressuring Trump. They leaked the existence of this channel of communication to mainstream media to sabotage it. They torpedoed the talks. As soon as the information was leaked to the media, Adam Boehler told Hamas, look, now the deal is off the table. Trump walked back from the deal, released the 5 American Israeli hostages, the one living and 4 dead, in return for nothing, just to show that you were, as a sign of good faith. So the deal was dismantled. And Israel didn't suffice there. They went after Adam Boehler himself and got him fired at the end. His nomination was withdrawn before he was confirmed in the Senate. Then the channel communication with Steve Witkoff came with a new bridging proposal. A bridging proposal is, as mediators put it to me, Hamas is here, Israel is here. The mediators managed to bridge the gap. Then Israel moves further to the right. And then the Americans come in and embrace some of Israel's new conditions as a bridging proposal. So they asked Palestinians to move even further to the right. Witkoff's proposal was basically release 5 living hostages on the first day in return for phase two negotiations that would happen at some point in an extension of 50 days of the ceasefire. And there would be a resumption of the humanitarian aid going into Gaza. There were two answers to this: Hamas, Israel. Hamas's answer was committing to the Adam Boehler outline, 1 living, 4 dead, and resumption of phase two negotiations that should start immediately. And they also wanted clarifications. What does the resumption of the humanitarian protocol mean? Because Israel never fulfilled it in the first place. Does it mean allowing caravans and bulldozers to go in? Does it mean Israel leaving the Philadelphia corridor between Rafah and Egypt? Does it mean Israel dismantling the checkpoints in the Netzarim corridor? All of the things that were stipulated in phase one but never fulfilled. Israel's response was to double down and move even further to the right. They wanted 11 captives to be released on day one and 16 bodies in return for 10 Palestinian prisoners per captive, which is way less than the terms of agreement in phase one. The terms of agreement was 1 Israeli hostage in return for 50 Palestinian prisoners, or 1 in return for 30 if the Israeli hostage is a civilian. If it's a soldier, then 50. Now it's 1 for 10 and 1 for 10 bodies. So Hamas is holding bodies of Israelis. Israel is holding about 100 times more bodies of Palestinians. There's something called the symmetry of numbers. Palestinian bodies being held ever since 1967 and even before, until today. So the other element of Israel's proposal was restricting the humanitarian aid that would go into Gaza. So they doubled down on never fulfilling the humanitarian protocol. They said, okay, we even want mediators to go underground and establish mechanisms that ensure the humanitarian aid would go to people that we want it to go to, and not to a single person that we deem Hamas or Hamas aligned or Hamas affiliated, which is a very abstract term that can engulf hundreds of thousands, because Hamas is the government, they're a military group and a political party, and also run a number of charities. And they also never committed to anything about withdrawal from Philadelphia or phase two itself. So that was the Israeli response. Steve Witkoff gave Hamas a deadline to agree to his outline. And he said after that deadline, it would be too late. Before that deadline expired, Israel resumed the genocide in Gaza immediately.
What do you think the reaction will be from the countries in the region, especially those neighboring Gaza and the West Bank and Israel? I mean, we've obviously seen Jordan and Egypt condemning this latest resumption of hostilities in Gaza, but we've also seen that over the course of the past 17 months, I believe they also haven't taken maybe radical steps to try to stop this. What do you think? Do you think this will make a difference?
Basically, like Arab countries immediately scrambled to try to salvage the ceasefire. So since yesterday, they invited the Hamas delegation again to Cairo. They're trying to get it back on track with resuming the ceasefire, especially that Hamas did not fire a single bullet at Israel after 460 people were killed in 2 days. So there is some hope that it will be back on track again. There was an Egyptian proposal now that is sort of a bridging proposal between Adam Boehler and Steve Witkoff. That's how insane it is. Like the Americans offer one thing, Americans offer another thing, and now you need Egypt to bridge it between the two Americans. And the Egyptian proposal is to release two living hostages instead of five or instead of one, and to release four bodies with them. It still remains to be seen what Israel's reaction to this would be, but you already know the Israeli mentality. You have the former chief of the Israeli Mossad, Tamir Pardo, who came yesterday and said, quote, Netanyahu is putting the lives of the hostages and IDF soldiers at risk for the sake of maintaining his government. He poses a clear and immediate danger to the security of the state of Israel, a man without conscience and without a compass. So it's unlikely that Israel would agree to this. It's unlikely that Israel would even now accept the Steve Witkoff proposal. Once they go back to bombing Gaza, there's no going back from there unless Trump puts his foot on the pedal and says, no, stop it here. And that's also unlikely. What measures can Arab countries take at the moment? I cannot think of much. Like Egypt, for example, they have their own borders with Gaza that are now fully controlled by Israel because Israel controls the Philadelphia corridor.
Yeah.
So the Egyptians cannot send in a single aid truck into Gaza without Israel's approval. Even before Israel took over Rafah, as soon as the war started, Egypt, there was some aid that is being sent towards Gaza from Egypt. Then Israel threatens Egypt explicitly. If you allow any truck into Gaza without our approval, we will bomb it. Just as clear of a threat as possible. Other countries can do much. They can, like, for example, Gulf countries hold a lot of influence on Trump, business dealings, as well as diplomatic political leverage. Saudi Arabia is supposed to invest about $1 trillion in the US economy. Saudi Arabia is the key with the Trump's desperation for getting the Abraham Accords back on track and including Saudi Arabia in it. That would be the biggest historic achievement for him. American diplomats, they tell us behind the scenes that Trump is desperate and serious about his Nobel Peace Prize. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. And he thinks that the Saudi-Israeli normalization would be the road to it. The Ukrainian-Russian peace agreement might be the road, but that might be more difficult, whereas the ceasefire in Gaza is easier. There are other countries that can do more in terms of lobbying and pressure, but I don't see any Arab countries like using any sort of genuine pressure on Israel. There are countries in the region, for example, that can easily cut off Israel's supplies that are coming from India and the East. There's this corridor that goes through multiple Arab countries since the war started, and the Houthis imposed a naval blockade on Israel from Eilat, from its southern seaport. But other Arab countries came in and allowed Israel to import food, water, and other merchandise, other commercial goods to come in trucks through their territory. They can restrict that, but that's very unlikely. In the European Union, they might hold more cards of leverage, the association council agreement, tariffs, trade, privileged status for Israel economically, lots of different agreement in terms of Horizon 2025, I think, and other academic cooperation agreements, Erasmus, etc. But that's also unlikely for them to take any step. Like I was just in Brussels a few days ago. The atmosphere there was completely despairing. I met a top European Union leader in July last year. Basically, the first thing he said to us, he said, "This is Chatham House rules, right?" We said, "Yes." So he responded, "We are completely irrelevant. We are completely useless." And then he said 80% of European governments are okay with letting Israel do whatever it does in Gaza, will not bother to do anything more than issuing statements. At most, you would get them to condemn. That's the best case scenario. Mostly, they would express statements of concern. Average case, they would condemn Hamas. They would not call out Israel. Like when Israel refused to uh, negotiate phase two and they cut water, food, electricity into Gaza, the EU's official statement was to condemn Hamas for it. They did not call out Israel. They didn't even call out starving 2 million people as a war crime or a crime against humanity. When Russia bombed some power plants in Ukraine, you had Ursula von der Leyen and Josep Borrell immediately calling this a crime against humanity and a terror act, a terrorist act. When it came to Israel, nothing of the sort. It's insane. So you get the impression that there are governments around the world that are not only complicit, that are not only sort of idle or standing by spectators, that are not only sort of aiding and abetting, but there are governments that actively want the genocide in Gaza to happen, that actively want Gaza to be emptied out. And it's not just the United States and Israel. There are governments that see Palestinians as a financial burden, that sees the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as something that is intractable and will never be solved. Because, for example, the European Union has an option between two things. Either you call out Israel that refuses a Palestinian state even through negotiations. They passed a Knesset law last year that was passed with a clear majority. Only 9 members out of 120 that opposed it. That was the Israeli Arab members of Knesset and one communist Jewish member of Knesset, Aufar Kesef. The majority voted for or abstained a Knesset resolution that opposes a Palestinian statehood in absolute terms, not even through negotiations. And you have Israel that de facto annexed the West Bank. That is now completely wiped out Gaza and wants to completely depopulate it. So it's a moment of truth. Either they call out Israel and pressure it, or they just let it happen, whatever Palestinians' fate it is would be, let it unfold to get rid of them. And the choice that's more convenient is the latter.
Yeah.
And some are happy to see it happening.
Yeah, and I guess the Europeans' position is further weakened by, the recent statements by Trump and his sort of stance on Russia and Ukraine, etc. I believe there's a lot of panic in the European Union, and standing up for doing something uncomfortable may not be in their interest right now or what they want to do. But I wanted to just ask you quickly about Trump himself. You said that he's out to get a peace prize, a Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, you could. I mean, he would certainly take credit for the ceasefire that took effect in January between Israel and Hamas. But now that the ceasefire is over, and I mean, Israel has started to bomb Gaza relentlessly again, like we said in the beginning, killing 1,000 people in just 48 hours or less. I mean, obviously the Americans were informed about this. Israel wouldn't have done it without the U.S. giving the green light, which means Trump giving the green light. So how does that go together? How does Trump allow this carnage to happen while simultaneously claiming to be the peace candidate and the Gaza Riviera, etc., etc.?
Oh, well, basically, you have Netanyahu who said on record, the US is something we can easily manipulate. He said it, I think, a couple of decades ago. And that's the same dynamic, especially with Trump. Like Netanyahu is frightened of Trump because Trump is unpredictable and he can flip. Friends become enemies in a second. So Israeli media makes clear that Netanyahu is scared of him. Israel itself is scared of him and trying to appease him. But at the same time, they know that Trump is easily influenced by the people around him. So, for example, in 2017, Trump visited Beit Lahem and met with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Before that meeting, he was told that Abbas is a terrorist in a suit, that Abbas is radical and extremist, that he wants to annihilate Israel, etc. And then he went to meet him. In that meeting, Abbas offered or presented the Palestinian position. He said, we want 22% of historic Palestine, even less than that. With land swaps, Israel gets to keep the vast majority of its settlements in the West Bank. We want a demilitarized, disarmed state with no national army. And NATO can be, or the US troops can be, the guarantors of Israel's security. We are actively collaborating with Israel against fellow Palestinians and have been since 1993, the security coordination mechanism in which the PA would kill detain, maim, shoot to kill, arrest Palestinians that are trying to attack Israel or that pose a threat to Israel. And he presented all these things. Trump was very impressed. He basically said, they told me that you're a terrorist. You're a very nice guy. Like, he even told Abbas that he can get a deal done and that he supports the Palestinian position 100%. He went on at the end and said a joke, like ironically, he said basically, I'm a very good businessman. When you get to the land swaps part of the negotiations, keeping Israeli settlements in return for getting a land in Israel of equal size, magnitude, and nature, when you get to the land swaps, call me because I work in real estate. I know how to find a good piece of land. I'm going to help you find a good piece of land in Israel. So Abbas looks around and he says, I think we solved the conflict. And the guys around him are very optimistic. Trump walks out of the room. Then Jared Kushner goes back in again. And he takes Saib Ariqat on the side. He pulls him at the side. Saib was the chief negotiator of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. And he tells Saib, look, everything that Trump just told you is null and void. Forget everything he said. You deal with me. And that was the end of it. We know what happened afterwards. The U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, moving the embassy there, defunding Palestinians, boycotting the PA, kicking the Palestinian ambassador out of Washington, allowing annexation, allowing all sorts of lunatic measures on the ground. So in that regard, there is something that's like there's now with Trump's administration, there are two different wings. There's the Marco Rubio, Huckabee Sanders, Mike Waltz wing of the administration that is hawkish, evangelical, messianic, racist, insane, and that are out there to support Israel no matter what. There's also the other team of Steve Witkoff. Mediators say that Steve Witkoff is dead serious about seeing the ceasefire go through, that he was not falling for Netanyahu's manipulations. Like the Qatar Egyptian mediators, they were optimistic about Witkoff. They said that without him, there could have not been a deal happening. So this power balance between the two determines the outcome of the administration. There's the other dimension. Netanyahu would put the Americans, would create facts on the ground and put them in front of a fait accompli. It's too late to do anything about it. So, for example, in the war, in the last 16 months, basically Israel would decide to go and kill Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's top leader and top negotiator in Iran, in Tehran. And they would tell the Americans afterwards, after he was killed. And you had Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister at the time. He said recently on a podcast, he said that Lloyd Austin, the American defense secretary, was very frustrated and upset with Israel for killing Haniyeh because Haniyeh was seen as a moderate interlocutor in Hamas. You have a lot of radicals, hardliners, and extremists, and some moderates relative to the others in the movement. So the Americans were optimistic about him. And then Israel took him out of the picture. So Gallant's response to this was, this guy is in part responsible for October 7th. Of course, we were going to take him out. So they would put facts on the ground in front of the Americans and just hope that the Americans will not call them out, which works every time. It worked under Biden. If you look at the ceasefire record, Biden presented an outline in May 2024. That was the Israeli position. It's basically Israel's negotiating team went to the White House behind Netanyahu's back and gave the Israeli proposal to Biden, said Netanyahu's going to sabotage it, present it yourself and speak to the Israeli public over Netanyahu's head, which is what Biden did in that very long primetime TV speech. After this, a round of negotiation happens. Hamas accepts the Biden initiative on July 2nd. Israel rejects it. Netanyahu imposes 4 impossible, incapacitating conditions that even his own army chiefs, even Yoav Gallant, said are ridiculous and are there to sabotage the agreement. And then he goes to kill Hamas's top negotiator. He goes to kill Hezbollah's top leaders to undermine the talks. When all of this happened, when the ceasefire talks were collapsing in August, the American response to this was 2 things. Number one, they pretended for a while that there was some progress and a breakthrough, although there was none. That was in August. And that was only because Kamala Harris's DNC inauguration was happening as the candidate of the Democratic Party. So they wanted it to pass without a hitch. The other thing, they didn't want Iran and Hezbollah to retaliate against the killing of Fuad Shukr and Ismail Haniyeh. As soon as there are ceasefire negotiations, you create this sort of positive deterrent that they would not try to sabotage the talks. After this passed, the US position became this. Every time Blinken is about to give a speech, he would go out and says, Israel accepted the ceasefire deal, Hamas rejected it. It was pathological. He would repeat it at every turn. Hamas rejected, Israel accepted. At the time, I went to the region multiple times, and the mediators would say, they would like shake us and yell in our faces. This is not true. The Americans are gaslighting. The Americans are rewriting history. Someone needs to call out Netanyahu. And the Americans would never do. And then I met an American top official, a senior diplomat, on the Palestinian topic. And I asked him, why did Blinken do this? I met him in February this year. So I said, why did Blinken do this pathologically the whole time? And he attributed it to three things. Number one, complete bias. He said Blinken took Israel's side at every corner, every turn of the road. That when the State Department, 90% of people there would be critical of Israel's actions, Blinken would tell them, you don't know how to negotiate, you don't know how to talk to the Israelis. I know what it's like, you don't know what it's like. Number two, complete incompetence. And number three, cowardice. And that's what Israel relies on: bias, incompetence, and cowardice.
So you've laid out the kind of the reality of what Israel is. And I think a lot of people in the West would call it harsh criticism at the very least. But you also don't shy away from holding Hamas to account. Could you explain, first of all, Hamas's role in all of this? And then also tell us why you think it's important, as someone who is a Palestinian human rights advocate, to also call out an organization like Hamas.
But basically, Hamas is it's an entity that feeds on failure and despair. So the secret of Hamas's popularity, the secret of their success, is not necessarily the appeal of their ideology. Most Palestinians don't subscribe to that sort of Islamist Muslim Brotherhood kind of doctrine. It is basically the failure of every other alternative, particularly the complete failure, foiling, and betrayal of the Palestinian peace camp. So when Palestinians internally try to debate any Hamas leaders and say, why don't you recognize Israel? Why don't you lay down your arms? Why don't you do this and that? Why don't you resort to nonviolence? Their answer would be, Abu Mazen did all these things. Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, the PLO, did all these things in 1988. What did they get out of it? Absolutely nothing. Can you name a good thing that came out of this? It's not only the complete futility, but it's also the humiliation, the destruction of the Palestinian peace camp. So Mahmoud Abbas is constantly called a terrorist, an insider in chief. He's constantly accused of trying to destroy Israel, although he's running the security collaboration with Israel that kills Palestinians to protect Israel's security. Other Palestinian peaceniks, for example, Isa Amru, the main champion of nonviolence in Hebron, Israel tortured him, imprisoned him, put him on an unfair trial in a military court, and Israeli settlers attack his home virtually daily, the IDF. There was one incident in which a New York Times reporter was with him in Hebron, and IDF soldiers started to attack Isa in front of him. The New York Times the reporter's own reaction was, this shows the price of the occupation on Israeli soldiers.
Yeah, I remember.
Israel would constantly call Isa a terrorist. When Israel comes out and calls Palestinian diplomacy diplomatic terrorism, Palestinian nonviolence PR terrorism, when they call Palestinian construction, like if you build a home in your land, they call it construction terrorism. If they kidnap you, put you in a prison without charge, trial, legal counsel, or any of this, and you go on a hunger strike, it's called terrorism in prison. If you go to the ICC, it's called international terrorism or diplomatic terrorism. If you try BDS or you try economic boycotts, they call it economic terrorism. And all of this is fuel for Hamas to just point the finger at the failure of every other alternative and say, this is the only one that can change things. You have to take matters into your own hands. There's like, even with nonviolence, Gaza had the most overwhelmingly non-violent, unprecedented movement in 2018, the Great March of Return, or you had 150,000 young people marching to the separation fence between Israel and Gaza, demanding the end of the blockade. And some people put up encampments in which they would read poetry, sing folklore songs, do dabka dancing, share Palestinian food. And then other people would approach the fence and try to protest there. Israel's reaction was to kill 220 people, almost 220 people, over the course of 2 years. The protest was happening every Friday. The commitment was remarkable. It was formidable. Not a single Hamas flag, only Palestinian flags there. Not a single person with a weapon. Basically, the most you got is Palestinian burning tires to create a smoke screen from Israeli snipers. The worst examples of like the extreme was people throwing rocks or Molotov cocktails at Israeli soldiers, which was sort of the exception, not the rule. When you have 150,000 people and you have 10 people that do that kind of thing, and the rest are just there marching and trying to make a public call for the right to life, Israel's reaction was like the killing was the tip of the iceberg. They maimed over 34,000 people. They shot people like ducks in a pond. They basically shot paramedics. They shot journalists. They shot double amputees. They shot children. They shot people in the back, like when they were 300 meters away from the fence, people leaning up against a tree. There was a Palestinian sports champion, a cyclist, that was shot in his knees while he was standing far, far away from the fence by Israeli snipers. It was sharpshooters. And there was Dr. Sliman Abu Sitta who went to Gaza and documented one case where Israeli snipers shot a young Palestinian man in both knees. And he said this is physically, practically impossible with a single shot. And it's impossible with two shots consecutively because a sniper shot would send you flying up in the air. So the only way that this could have happened is two snipers agreed to shoot that guy in his knees simultaneously. And the bullets that were used were dum-dum bullets that as soon as it hits a target, it fractures, takes a whole bulk of flesh and bone with it, that it becomes impossible for that person to maintain the limbs that were shot. And they focused on people's legs and knees and upper torso. And the Israeli goal behind it was very clear. You need to create cautionary tales that in every neighborhood, in every family, in every home, in every street, there should be a double amputee or a single amputee, someone limping, so that when Gazans look at him, they will not try nonviolent resistance again. So all of this feeds into Hamas's ideology and their appeal. It lends credence to what they're doing. Why I criticize them, it's moral consistency. And it's also having a duty to your fellow Palestinians to maintain sort of effectiveness and appeal and moral consistency of your struggle. We don't have the luxury of being flawed victims. That's unfortunate. If you have a powerful state or a powerful movement, if we are Israel, you can do whatever you want and nobody's going to bother with the details. Like, I think it was Woodrow Wilson that said, talk quietly and take a sledgehammer or take a giant stick. But when you're not powerful, you need to fit into a specific category of a specific victim. It's shameful. It's excruciating. You are never enough, but you need to be a perfect victim to maintain your appeal. While at the same time, like if you become too much of a victim, you will lose support because you're not able to inspire. You become like the Rohingyas. Things are happening to them. They're not doing anything about it in terms of mass coherent mobilization. Therefore, they're passive victims that might enjoy some sporadic sympathy, but not support, because there's no way of supporting them. So you need to dance on this tightrope of being a perfect victim, but also being a perfect resistance actor in a way that appeals to a broader movement, not just to a fringe left-wing minority that would support you. And if you lose your way, if you deviate from that, you should be called out. But also, Hamas is not just claiming to be an armed resistance movement. They're also a government. And once you are in charge of people's lives, once you are oppressing them in the name of the occupation, in the name of the blockade, like when Hamas goes and arrests journalists or dissidents, they would arrest them based on charges of espionage. They would say, if you are criticizing the government or Hamas and you're trying to destabilize Gaza, you must be pushed by Israel or the Palestinian Authority or Arab countries or the US or Europe. You wouldn't do it out of sort of like pure generosity and good-heartedness. You're doing it because someone is pushing you to do it to destabilize Palestinians. So that's how they justify it. And that's why it should be called out. There's Palestinians are under multi-layered oppression. The main cause of all of it is Israel, is the apartheid, is the occupation that's there. There's no getting around it. But that does not give you an absolute blanket of impunity from your actions. Like in apartheid South Africa, there were people that thought that Mandela was a collaborator, that he was too lenient, too moderate, that he didn't go far enough, he was not radical enough. There were people that were shaming Mandela after he signed the agreement, after apartheid was dismantled. At the same time, like while I acknowledge that Hamas should be called out, Palestinian other armed groups should be called out for their mistakes and actions and transgressions and offenses. You should maintain that that does not delegitimize the Palestinian struggle. South Africans, they resorted to something called necklacing. Mandela's own wife, she murdered a person, and it was said of her that she sort of delighted in necklacing. Necklacing was when they would tie a rope around white people's necks and sort of like lynch them alive in Africa. Native indigenous Americans who were doing scalping, they would just cut with a rough blade the entire foreskin, the forehead of a person off with the hair, with all of it, expose the skull. That in itself, like Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion, they smashed the skulls of babies in their cribs. Resorting to these extreme actions, the action should be condemned, but it does not delegitimize the cause itself, doesn't call out the struggle.
Mohammed Shehada, we've taken up far too much of your time already. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today on Kalam Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.